from voting, from registering. And so, yes, the Supreme Court passed a decision in Shelby versus Holder. Shelby in Alabama, a county that had discriminated greatly and was discriminating at that point in time. And as soon as the Supreme Court said this is no longer necessary, we saw a cascade of new laws to restrict access to the ballot box. A cascade. When Dr. King was born, neither African-American men or African-American women could cast ballots and participate in our democracy in many states and jurisdictions, north and south. Before he was killed, at just 39 years of age, Dr. King led a movement to correct the injustices that had come about because for so long, many Americans had no recourse to participate in our democracy or pursue opportunities equally because their states felt they had the right to discriminate. That's what state rights were in my generation. And apparently, the concept still exists that that is the right. The right to vote is the guarantee to all others. Dr. King, joined by other giants of the civil rights movement, including our dear friend and brother, my, GK and I were just saying how sad we are that John Lewis is not on this floor, who gave blood and almost his life, but lived his life to assure that every American had the right to vote and was facilitated in that right. Dr. King, joined by other giants of the civil rights movement, including our friend and brother, John Lewis, used the tools of nonviolent, peaceful protests and organizing to expose the hypocrisy of a system that called itself a democracy but did not allow all of its citizens to share in electing leaders. Each year, on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, Americans reflect on the lessons of his life and on the civil rights movement as though they formed a chapter in America's past. Would that they mirrored simply the past, Mr. Speaker. But if we look around us today, there can be no doubt that the fight for our democracy is very much a part of our present. Now, this is a radical bill that will allow a process in the United States Senate that's a failing practice. The majority will rule on debating this bill. The majority. Isn't that a radical proposal that the majority of the Senate that is for this bill? When people get up and say, oh, this bill can't pass, the only reason it can't pass is because the minority will stop it, if they can. I hope they can. I hope they change their rules. I am an opponent of the filibuster. It is undemocratic. And as Hamilton said, it poisons democracy. The right to vote has not been so endangered since Dr. King walked among us. But there's a remedy. It's not perfect, but it will go a long way toward turning back the tide of voter suppression and protecting the fundamental right to vote. One nation, under God, indivisible. All of us could vote. The legislation incorporated into this bill represents the boldest and most consequential voting rights reforms in a generation. I was the sponsor of the Help America Vote Act. It was called then a very consequential bill. It was not nearly as consequential as this bill will be in empowering every person eligible to vote. And by the way, every citizen, from my perspective, to vote. So there's no mischaracterization of my view. I want to thank Chairman Nadler, Representative Sewell, Representative Sarbanes, Chairwoman Beatty, and the entire Congressional Black Caucus, and literally hundreds of members who through the years have fought to protect this sacred right. In addition to providing for automatic online and same-day voter registration, the Freedom to Vote Act will make Election Day a federal holiday. A holy day, if you will, in the pursuit of our secular commitment to democracy. It will guarantee at least 15 days of early voting. Isn't that terrible? Well, it must be terrible because many states throughout the country are cutting those days down. Why? I don't know. If you vote on Tuesday as opposed to Thursday, is there more fraud involved? I don't know. It will guarantee those days and 2 weekends while ending requirements for difficult-to-obtain photo ID. It doesn't eliminate ID. If states have ID, it does not eliminate that. Importantly, this legislation will restore voting rights to those who have paid their debts to society, and it will ensure that those who cast eligible ballots provisionally in the wrong precincts will still have their votes counted. As the sponsor of the Help America Vote Act in 2002, that provision was in the federal law. This bill would limit partisan gerrymandering and remove the corrosive influence of dark money. My mother used to tell me, consider the source. If the money is dark and you don't know who's paying the bill for the talk that's being given to you, you can't make that judgment. You can't determine who the source is. When it comes to defending the integrity of our elections and our democracy, this legislation is absolutely needed in America. Not only will it prohibit the removal of election officials without cause, which is happening because a president calls up and says, can't you find some more votes? That was the asking of some elected official, Secretary of State of Georgia, to commit a crime. Talk about fraud in elections. Also critical, this legislation will shore up the U.S. Election Assistance Commission created under the Help America Vote Act, an agency created by, I just said that. It will enable the EAC to provide state and local boards of election with grants to upgrade outdated voting equipment and protect against hackers and cyber threats. It wasn't till 2003 that the federal government paid part of the election costs incurred in electing federal officials. Also restoring the full force of the 65 Voting Rights Act, which was undermined by Shelby versus Holder. Applying it to every state, not discrimination. If you break the law in any state, if you preclude people from legitimately voting in any state, you're covered under this legislation. We don't pick out any actor. Every state is included. We apply it to every state, and updating it for the 21st century. The Freedom to Vote Act has the power to restore trust that our elections are fair and that every eligible voter will be able to participate. House Democrats have passed voting rights measures multiple times this Congress, sending both H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 to the Senate. The majority's for it, but the filibuster stops it. The minority controls the majority. Madison said that was not democracy. Now the Senate must act. I urge senators to come together on Monday and approve this historic voting rights legislation for our time. We have the opportunity. I share G.K. Butterfield's sadness that John Lewis is not on this floor to cast his vote. And very frankly, I would have yielded all the time I've taken to John Lewis to talk to us about how important this legislation is and how many people gave their lives and their blood and their time and their talent to accomplish an America where no person would be shut out of the ballot box. In future years, I hope Americans will be able to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day by reflecting not only how our country overcame Jim Crow in the 20th century, but how we prevented its return in 2022. I know we've heard, oh, this is not Jim Crow, this is that. No matter how subtle the discrimination may be, it is discrimination. Cast your vote for this bill today, ladies and gentlemen, so our citizens cast their votes without hindrance and share equally in the making of our laws and in the shaping of our future. Vote yes. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman, and I, in the lengthy oration of 1 minute from the Majority Leader, I agreed with one word, that this is a radical bill. And the Majority Leader's argument is a baby throwing the baby out with the bathwater argument. The states in this country remain a bulwark of democracy. The rhetoric from Democrats is that democracy itself won't survive without their elections bill. Well, nothing speaks of preserving our democracy like a late-night gut and replace in the Rules Committee. A bill about NASA gets 700-plus pages added and a floor vote within 18 hours. Nothing speaks of preserving our democracy like giving Washington control of voter ID laws. When 35 elected state legislatures have adopted them, 74% of the people favor them. People in my state voted to put it in our state constitution, and most believe elections should be made more secure. Nothing speaks more of preserving our democracy than shifting the power to set election law from 50 decentralized states where legislatures controlled by different parties have predominantly held and exercised that power for all 233 years of our experience under the Constitution, and centralizing that power in a single agency, the Department of Justice, at any time controlled by one party. Nothing speaks of preserving our democracy like abandoning historic parliamentary norms to accomplish this radical transformation with bare majorities in both houses of Congress, without one vote from the minority party. Democrats may continue gerrymandering in Illinois and Maryland with abandon, but they assure you that if you just put all the control of elections into their hands in Washington, they will save democracy for you. It calls to mind the iconic Vietnam-era phrase, "We had to burn the village to save it." America, that's Democrats' message to you. They will burn your democracy to the ground in order to save it. And they can't let anything stop them from getting it done before they face your verdict this November. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask my friend from North Carolina to refer to the bill, the section that refers to voter ID. It simply says, this bill sets uniform national standards for states that choose to require identification to vote. At this time, Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House of Representatives, Ms. Pelosi of California.
The honourable gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership. Mr. Speaker, today our nation faces the most dangerous assault on the vote since Jim Crow. Last year alone, more than 440 draconian voter restrictions have been introduced across 49 states, with at least 19 states enacting 34 measures into law. This legislation seeks not only to suppress access to the ballot, but empower states to nullify election results entirely. That's what the legislation that I referenced across the country. This sinister campaign has particularly targeted communities of color. As the House Committee on House Administration proved in last summer's report, partisan forces are accelerating a sinister campaign to silence the voices of color in particular. There are four things, just four things I want people to know about the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Four things to remember and one observation. The four reasons why every member should vote for this bill today. First, it ends shameful voter suppression and election subversion, which lets local officials simply choose winners and losers based on their own political interest. Nullification of elections. Vote no on that. Secondly, it ends partisan gerrymandering, so that the redistricting process will meet the standards of the Constitution, of the Voting Rights Act, and keep communities of interest together, ending partisan gerrymandering. One, and stopping voter suppression and voter nullification, election nullification. Two, ending partisan gerrymandering. Third, it stops big, dark, special interest money which is suffocating the airways with misrepresentations, which does also suppress the voices of the American people. Get rid of big, dark money. People can still give their big, dark special interest, but they have to disclose it so that the public knows. And fourth, this legislation empowers the grassroots by rewarding their participation in our democracy, amplifying their voice, and yes, with the power of matching their small dollar contributions. Hear this. There are no taxpayer dollars involved in that, no matter what you might hear them misrepresent. No taxpayer dollars. So 4 things. End voter suppression and election nullification, end political gerrymandering, end big, dark special interest money crushing the political system, and 4, reward the grassroots. That is in the Freedom to Vote Act. In the John Lewis Act, which is part of what we're voting on today, I just want to be clear. This Voting Rights Act has been strongly bipartisan. Indeed, Republican Presidents Nixon, Ford, Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and George W. Bush, who signed the most recent Voting Rights Act, which received like 390 votes in the House, unanimous in the Senate, signed by George W. Bush, bipartisan. And 4 times the Congress has reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in a bipartisan way. This is the first time we have the assault that we have on that. I'm very, very proud of the House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker, because we have twice passed the For the People Act, which is as Protect Our Vote is, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Even before he passed and had this named in his honor, we passed it once. The House has made clear we stand with the people in the fight for voting rights. I do want to, again, in closing, commend you, Mr. Butterfield, for your leadership on all of this, going around the country. John Sarbanes, the author of our For the People Act. Terry Sewell, the author of the Voting Rights Act. Zoe Lofgren, the chair of the House Administration Committee. Mr. Nadler, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. And I also want to acknowledge the work of Jim McGovern, the chair of the Rules Committee, who has brought these bills to the floor time and time again. It is a day when Democrats will once again take a strong step to defend our democracy as we send the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to the Senate for urgent consideration. Nothing less is at stake than our democracy. With that, I urge a strong bipartisan aye vote on this legislation and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in objection to 5746, which is the latest attempt by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to ignore the 10th Amendment and dump on the state legislatures of this nation, basically telling them you're incompetent, not to mention the clerks. Democrats first tried to barge through the front door of the election administration with H.R. 1. After that failed, they tried an overall on the backdoor functions, and this bill represents a full-blown takeover. The supposedly slimmed-down bill would still override state laws by creating a federal right to no-excuse mail-in voting and require states to accept late-arriving ballots as long as they have timely postmarks. It's kind of a joke. It would automatically give felons the right to vote. Great. It would also override state voter ID requirements. Listen, only a few months ago, Mr. Speaker, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle argued that voter ID laws suppress voter turnout, only to flip-flop once they saw that the public overwhelmingly supports proof of identity before casting a ballot, 80% in some states. I'm proud to have implemented strong voter ID laws during my time in the Wisconsin legislature. Unfortunately, leading up to the 2020 election, I saw these protections steamrolled under the guise of the pandemic. Let's talk about the Supreme Court in 2013. A decision recognized that we are no longer living in the Jim Crow era. The original Voters' Rights Act worked, and extreme policies like preclearance are no longer required. Allegations that election integrity measures that have been adopted by states such as Texas and Georgia don't amount to anything close to Jim Crow era restrictions, and is a slap in the face to those who endured real discrimination. There is no voting rights crisis. This is not about ensuring access to the polls. This is about taking power from the state legislatures and concentrating in our electoral systems. And I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished Democratic whip, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn, who has led the way in this House and in the South for generations. Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. I thank my friend, the gentleman from North Carolina, for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I rise to urge passage of this legislation carrying the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to the Senate for immediate consideration to safeguard our most fundamental constitutional right, the right to vote. We took an oath to protect this country from all threats of foreign and domestic. Today, we face a domestic threat from those seeking to gain and hold power by suppressing votes and nullifying election results. Congress must combat this threat by ensuring equal and unencumbered access to the ballot box and ensuring an accurate vote count. It is time to choose. Will we uphold our oath and protect this fragile democracy? Or will we subvert the Constitution and fetter the franchise? I want to remind the previous speaker that we did not have Jim Crow before there was Jim Crow. And we did not have Jim Crow, and we had it until 1954. I used to teach this stuff called history, and I will say to my colleagues, anything that's happened before can happen again. It was the lack of the vote that had 95 years between George Washington Murray, who was the last African American to represent South Carolina here in this body, until I came along in 1992.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Why? Because the right to vote was taken away.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Were nullified. We are not going back. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd like to reserve at this time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, a coveted member of the House Committee on Administration, my friend, Jamie Raskin.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Floor Leader. Our colleagues object to guaranteeing the people's right to vote through the vehicle of a NASA bill, of all things. You know, a quarter century ago, Republicans changed Texas state law to permit astronauts to vote absentee from space. They want to make it easier to vote from space, and they want to make it harder to vote on Earth. In the last election, tens of thousands of citizens in Texas waited in line for 6 hours to vote. An astronaut on the International Space Station could have orbited planet Earth 4 times in the 6 hours that Texas forced some of its citizens to wait in line to vote. Across the country, it's voter suppression, GOP gerrymandering of our districts, right-wing court packing and judicial activism to destroy the Voting Rights Act in cases like Shelby County versus Holder and Brnovich, and deployment of the filibuster to block voting rights legislation. The whole matrix of GOP democracy suppression today. It's time to protect the right to vote here on earth. If it takes a Nassau bill to do it, then I invite my GOP colleagues to boldly go where none of them have ever gone before, to planet Earth on a mission to defend the voting rights of the people. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Although it seems like, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to go where no man's ever gone before, and that's to call Mr. Loudermilk from Georgia my good friend.
Gentleman's recognized.
He's recognized for 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I rise today, obviously, in strong opposition to this latest attempts by my colleagues on the other side to enact a federal takeover of elections and continue their tactics that they have used consistently in this Congress and the last Congress to hide the intent of what they're doing. Make no mistake, this legislation is an attempt to circumvent state legislatures' constitutional authority to set election laws. Laws like the one recently passed in Georgia that maximizes voter access and protects the integrity of every legal ballot. One-size-fits-all government has never worked in a diverse and free society like we have here in the United States of America. One-size-fits-all is synonymous with dictatorial regimes, socialist societies, and communist countries. Governments that keep control over the people by stripping the authority from the hands of local officials that were elected by the people to represent them. This is what this bill does. Let's be clear. The goal of strong central governments, strong federal governments, is to have a homogeneous society that is easily controlled. Easily controlled. Our society is diverse, diversity of thought, diversity of action, diversity of speech. But the actions of my colleagues on the other side is to have a homogeneous society to where right and wrong is no longer determined by personal conviction or faith, but what the federal government has determined is right and wrong. You don't have to look any further of how the right to determine your own health care has been stripped away by my colleagues on the other side, where people can no longer determine what they will and will not put into their body. The Constitution protects the ideas of individual liberty and federalism to where government is strongest at the local level. This bill disregards state voter IDs, and one thing I want to bring up is homogeneous when it comes to campaign elections. Can I get 30?
Gentleman, 15 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 15 seconds.
I appreciate the gentleman here. We live in an independent, diverse society where local governments are the greatest authority over the people. This is a takeover by the federal government to create a homogeneous society where everyone acts, thinks, and works according to the federal government. Oppose this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, the distinguished Vice Chair of the House Democratic Caucus, and I might say a member of the Election Subcommittee, of which I have the honor to chair, Mr. Aguilar.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for yielding. I rise today in support of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, legislation that would protect the right to vote and strengthen our democracy. This week, we heard President Biden travel to the home of our late colleague, John Lewis, rally the nation around the need to protect and expand the right to vote. Today, we will pass this legislation in honor of John's name. But in order to honor our colleague, we must make good on our commitment. We must pass this legislation in both chambers without delay. We must also make clear, as President Biden did this week, that there is nothing more important, no rules or procedures, than the health of our democracy. There's far too much at stake to let tradition get in the way of real progress. I know from my work on the committee and the Select Committee investigating the attack on the U.S. Capitol that the concerns about the future of the American system, the consent of the governed, are well-founded. Mr. Speaker, every member of this body has a choice today, and the world will remember where we stood. I am proud to stand on the side of democracy, on the side of making it easier to vote, not more difficult, and on the side of the people. Because the American people are with us. This is not a Democratic issue or Republican issue. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and pass this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Reserved.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time, it is my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Alabama, my dear friend and the sponsor of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, Ms. Terry Sewell of Selma, Alabama.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, voting rights is personal to me. It was in my hometown in 1965 on a bridge in Selma, Alabama, where John Lewis and the foot soldiers shed blood for the equal right of all Americans to vote. 56 years later, old battles have become new again as state legislatures erect direct barriers to the ballot box. 400 bills introduced, 34 passed in 19 states. Once again, our nation is at an inflection point. Today, the House of Representatives will once again send voting rights over to the Senate, and it must pass, Mr. Speaker. I implore our senators, do what is right. You have changed your rules 150 times, most recently to raise the debt ceiling. If you can protect the full faith and credit of the United States, surely you can protect the democracy. The time is now. What we need is courage. As we prepare to observe the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, let us remember that justice delayed can be justice denied. Senators, we need your leadership. We need it now.
I'd remind everyone to direct your remarks to the chair. Gentleman reserved, gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I appreciate that reminder. I'd like to now yield 1 minute to my good friend from the state of Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Republicans are trying to protect everyone's right to vote and the integrity of the election. It boggles my mind that in some cities in the United States, non-citizens are allowed to vote. And here in Washington, D.C. and other cities, when we go to a restaurant, we need to show our passport, vaccination database passport, saying that we're fully vaccinated before we're allowed to enter. But yet, my Democrat colleagues don't seem to want voter ID. In the state of Arizona, we have a law in place that requires voter ID to vote. We also have a law in place that was held up by the courts that prohibits ballot harvesting. Yet, it continues to boggle my mind that our Democrat colleagues want to undo what the states have done, undo state rights. I am opposed to this bill.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to remind my friend from Arizona who just spoke that this bill sets uniform national standards for states that choose to require identification to vote. The bill gives states the flexibility to choose whether to require voter IDs. It is not a mandatory voter ID law. At this time, Madam Speaker, it is my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a thoughtful leader on the Committee on Judiciary, Mr. Mondaire Jones.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, my colleagues across the aisle have asked why we're voting today to protect our democracy. The answer is as clear to me as it is unimaginable to them. For the people. This one's for the people who made today possible, for the young people who cast their first votes in 2020, and for the seniors who cast their first votes in 1966 after passage of the original Voting Rights Act, for the people who, like John Lewis, put their lives on the line on Bloody Sunday, and for the people who risked their lives to overcome racist voter suppression at the height of this pandemic. For people like my mentor and professor, the late Lonnie Guinier, mother of the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act. For the people who don't have a vote, but who do have a voice. Voting rights are preservative of all other rights. But time is running out. We can still have a democracy, Madam Speaker, but only if we pass this legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized. Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, at this time I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, my friend, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, who stays in perpetual motion, Ms. Rosa DeLauro.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Ensuring all Americans can freely participate in the electoral process is a bedrock of our democratic society. Today, in this country, we are witnessing an attack on that sacred right to vote, restricting voting access. We must act to restore federal oversight. What we do will determine the course of our democracy for generations to come. Our late colleague John Lewis shed blood for the right of all Americans to vote. Let us honor the legacy of those who fought to protect voting rights and pass this critical legislation. President Biden made our choice today clear, and I quote, "Will we choose democracy over autocracy, light over shadows, justice over injustice?" And like the President, I know where I stand, and I urge my colleagues to join me in voting for the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Reserve, please.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, may we inquire about how much time each side has remaining?
The gentleman from North Carolina has 6.5 minutes. The gentleman from Illinois has 2.25 minutes. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for giving us the time check. At this time, it is my delight to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, my friend and another member who stays in perpetual motion, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, a member of the Judiciary Committee, a senior member of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
To the distinguished leader of this debate, Mr. Butterfield, for your service to this nation, I am grateful. This is a somber, sacred moment in our lives on this floor. I stand here in the name of the blood shed by those foot soldiers, Dr. Martin Luther King and John Robert Lewis, who shed his blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. My friends who vote no today will disregard and ignore that bloodshed. I refuse to ignore the blood that was shed for the right to vote. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, this committee built over the course of 13 hearings in 2 Congresses, led by Jerry Nadler and Steve Cohen, the record for the John Robert Lewis bill. And for that, I am grateful, for I stand as a victim of the lack of preclearance. The bills that we have will eliminate a legislature, as Texas bill states, to overturn duly voters' choice. It will prevent the purging of voters, which happens all the time. It will protect you at the polls, and it will disallow people from interfering with your vote. It is now a sacred honor and charge. We must vote now in the name of Martin King and John Robert Lewis. We cannot do any less. The Senate must do its job. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd reserve, please.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, this time I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, from Houston, Texas, Harris County, my friend, my classmate, Congressman Al Green, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker, and still I rise. Our country has a history of discriminating against people of color and women when it comes to the right to vote. But that all changed in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Because you see, prior to his signing that act in 1965, there were 4 Asian members of Congress. In 2021, there were 21 members. There were 4 Latino members of Congress. In 2021, 54. There were 6 black members of Congress. In 2021, 60. And there were 18 women in Congress in 1965, and in 2021, there were 147. We must restore the Voting Rights Act and protect democracy. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd like to reserve, please.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. At this time, in the interest of time, I will yield 1/2 minute, that's 30 seconds, to the gentleman from Dallas, Texas, my friend, Congressman Colin Allred from the 32nd Congressional District.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, this should be a bipartisan vote. The right to vote has been reauthorized, and the Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized overwhelmingly by bipartisan majorities in this House and unanimously in the Senate. My constituent, George W. Bush, signed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. But now it's time for us to not just restore the Voting Rights Act, but to make sure that we expand voting rights across the country, to give us a sword and a shield. The shield of the Voting Rights Act to protect the right to vote, to protect changes, and the sword of the Freedom to Vote Act and the expansions that it will provide to vote by mail, voter registration, and allow every single American to make their voice heard in our elections. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd like to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, again, how much time do we have remaining?
The gentleman has 4 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, I'm prepared to close.
Would the gentleman like to yield me a couple minutes, too?
I will yield time to you.
No,
All
I'm
right.
good. I'm good.
You are my friend, Mr. Davis, and I want the world to know that.
You are my friend. I appreciate it. I enjoy the debate, and I am prepared to close, if I may.
The gentleman is recognized.
It's friendships like this, Mr. Butterfield, that I look around this chamber, and I think we as Americans should be celebrating what America's doing right. Look at the diversity of who serves here in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was necessary to stop discrimination, and it's worked. But make no mistake, today's bill is not a voting rights bill. Today's bill, unfortunately, is a bill that leads to lining your own campaign coffers with public funds. Now, Speaker Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, was here on the floor today, and no matter how many times she says it, that there's no taxpayer funds, it doesn't make it true. Let me go through. What happens is the original H.R. 1, when proposed last Congress, did have taxpayer funding of political campaigns, our own campaigns, but now they take the first ever corporate money through corporate fines, they put it into the Department of Treasury's laundering machine, and it comes out as part of the Department of Treasury. That's not public funds. Does that mean when you send your check to pay your taxes and it goes to the Department of Treasury that those aren't public funds? Every single person who votes yes for this bill that is not a voting rights bill is voting to line their own campaign pockets. That is not what the American people want. 94% of Americans say it's easy to vote. We have asked time and time again, give me one person to show up at a hearing that said that they wanted to vote in the last election and couldn't. Not one person has walked through that door. Not one person has showed up on a Zoom call. Not one person. Why in the world do we continue to try to gaslight the American people into thinking that this is about voting rights? This is not about voting rights. This is about lining your own campaign coffers. This is about breaking a tradition in the Senate. This is about taking over and winning elections for one side over the other.
Gentleman's time has expired.
No on this bill.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume in order to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, Madam Speaker, let me thank the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rodney Davis, When members of Congress say to each other, "You are my friend," I just want the world to know that we mean that sincerely. Mr. Davis and I are genuinely friends. I am the chairman of the subcommittee. He is the ranking member of our full committee, and we have a whole relationship. We respect each other. Thank you so much, Mr. Davis, and thank you to our chair of the full Committee on House Administration, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, who allowed me to manage the floor today, and I want to thank her for her leadership, not only on this committee, but also on the Committee on the Judiciary. Madam Speaker, this has been a healthy debate. This is the way Congress should work. This is a healthy debate, and I look forward to debate in the Senate. I hope it will start forthwith and conclude on Monday. I look forward to passage in the United States Senate. Madam Speaker, the choice before the House today is clear. We must protect our democracy. It is past time. It is past time for this Congress to act. Historically, Madam Speaker, the House is not in order.
House will be in order. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, it is past time for Congress to act. Historically, we have come together to protect the right to vote. From the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that I remember so well, its subsequent reauthorizations and various election administration bills, we have protected and expanded the right to vote. And Madam Speaker, we must do that again. The Voting Rights Act works. Along with Lonnie Guinier and Julius Chambers and Leslie Winter and Jack Greenberg of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I joined with them in the 1980s and successfully litigated Voting Rights Act cases in North Carolina. The Voting Rights Act works. Throughout my career, I have witnessed this body come together to ensure all Americans have a voice in this democracy. We must do that again now. One of our most sacred rights in this country is the right to vote. Indeed, as the Supreme Court observed in Westbury versus Sanders, other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. As a Congress, as a nation, we must not tolerate any voter suppression, any voter discrimination of any kind in any state in America. And so I respectfully urge all of my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, all 435 of us, I urge all of us to support this bill. Vote yes. And Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time for a vote.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 868, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion by the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion, the gentleman from Illinois.
I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Section 3S of the House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Illinois. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representatives Presley and Grijalva, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Bass of California, Mr. Torres of New York, Ms. Wilson of Florida, and Ms. Pingree of Maine, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Speer, I inform the House that Representative Speer will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Mace of South Carolina, I inform the House that Ms. Mace will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representatives Porter and McEachin, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As a member designated by Representative Ruiz, I inform the House that Representative Ruiz will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon, Mr. DeSania of California, Mr. Lowenthal of California, Ms. Barragan of California, Mr. Liu of California, Ms. Moore of Wisconsin, Mr. Cohen of Tennessee, and Mr. Moulton of Massachusetts, I inform the House that these 8 members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Yes, ma'am. Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Nels of Texas, I inform the House that Mr. Nels will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Delaware seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. DeGette of Colorado, I inform the House that Ms. DeGette will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Speaker, as the member designated by Reps. Christ, Cardenas, Castor, and Lawson, I inform the House that these members will vote yea on the motion.
Does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
The member designated by Chairwoman Zoe Lofgren, Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, and Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, I inform the House that these members will vote yea on the motion.
Does the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Representative Welsh of Vermont, I inform the House that Representative Welsh will vote yes on the motion.
What purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Hagedorn from Minnesota, I inform the House that Mr. Hagedorn will be voting no on H.R. 5746. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by members Swazi, Pocan, Doggett, and Jayapal, I rise to inform the House that these members will vote aye on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Louis Gohmert of the great state of Texas, I inform the House that Mr. Gohmert will vote no on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Chairwoman Maxine Waters, I inform the House that Chairwoman Waters will vote yes on the motion.
Gentlewoman from California seek recognition.
Designated by Ms. Kim of California, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Ms. Kim will vote no on the House amendment to Senate amendment to H.R. 5746.
Purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Stanton, I inform the House that Representative Stanton will vote yes on the motion.
Does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? You are recognized.
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Smucker of Pennsylvania, I inform the House that Mr. Smucker will vote no on H.R. 5746.
Purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Katko of New York, I inform the House that Mr. Katko will vote no on H.R. 5746. And Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois, I inform the House that Mr. Kinzinger will vote no on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, Mr. DeFazio votes yes on the motion.
what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek
Madam
recognition?
Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Bonamici, Brownlee, and Mang, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
Does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the member designated by Representative Adams of North Carolina, I inform the House that Representative Adams will vote yes on the motion to concur.
Does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
As a member designated by Representative Swalwell Gomez, I inform the House that these members will vote aye on the motion. And as the member designated by Representative Boyle, I inform the House that these members will vote aye on the motion.
Purpose does the gentlewoman from Kansas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Rep. Cleaver, I inform the House that Rep. Cleaver will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Brooks from Alabama, I inform the House that Mr. Brooks will vote no on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
As the member designated by Reps Bush and Ocasio-Cortez, I inform the House that these members will vote aye on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Panetta of California, I inform the House that Mr. Panetta will vote yes on the motion.
Purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Representative Ruppersberger, I inform the House that Mr. Ruppersberger will vote yes on the motion.
Purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the member designated by Representatives Del Bene and Barra, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Maria Valera Salazar of Florida and Mr. Waltz of Florida, I inform the House that Ms. Salazar and Mr. Waltz will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Good morning, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as the designated member by the gentleman from Texas, Congressman Crenshaw, I inform the House that Congressman Crenshaw will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
The gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. McCall of Texas, I inform the House that Mr. McCall will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
As the member designated by Representative Stansbury, I inform the House that Representative Stansbury will vote yes on the motion.
For what does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Herrera Butler of Washington, I inform the House that Ms. Herrera Butler will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Jerry Nadler of New York, Ann Kirkpatrick of Arizona, Andy Kim of New Jersey, Donald Payne of New Jersey, Albio Series of New Jersey,
and Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey. I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion. All right, Emma, another week goes by.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Good morning, Madam Speaker. As the member designated by the Honorable Mr. James Langevin of Rhode Island, and pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Mr. Langevin will vote yes on the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Thank you.
Purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Representatives Auchincloss, Chu, Cooper, Ledger Fernandez, and Frankel, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As a member designated by Representative Kahele, I inform the House that Mr. Kahele will vote yes on the motion.
Purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representatives Titus of Nevada, Price of North Carolina, Kind of Wisconsin, and Doyle of Pennsylvania, I inform the House that these members will vote aye on the motion.
Did you vote for yourself? Purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Carolyn Maloney of New York, I inform the House that Congresswoman Maloney will vote yea on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Colorado seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Gates from Florida, I inform the House that Mr. Gates will vote nay on the motion. Thank you.
Does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Lee of California and Ms. Tlaib of Michigan, pursuant to H.R.S. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Lee and Ms. Tlaib will vote yea on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as members designated by Congressmember Napolitano, Congressmember Vela, Congressmember Cuellar, Congressmember Vargas, Congressmember Roybal Ellert, and Congressmember Vicente Gonzalez, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by John Garamendi of California, I inform the House that John Garamendi will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
As a member designated by Representative Caston, I inform the House that this member will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Dwight Evans of Pennsylvania's 3rd District and pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Evans will vote yea on the House amendment to Senate Amendment H.R. 5746, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated for Mr. Crawford from Arkansas, I inform the House that Mr. Crawford will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Jacobs of New York, I inform the House that Mr. Jacobs will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Dakota seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Reschenthaler from Pennsylvania, I inform the House that Mr. Reschenthaler will vote no on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
North Carolina. As a member designated by Mr. Lamborn of Colorado, I inform the House that Mr. Lamborn will vote no on H.R. 5746. As a member designated by Mr. Reed of New York, I inform the House that Mr. Reed will vote no on H.R. 5746. Further, as a member designated by Mr. Risher Husson of North Carolina, I inform the House that Risher Husson will vote no on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Bobby Rush of Illinois, I inform the House that Mr. Rush will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
As the member designated by Representative Schreier, I inform the House that Representative Schreier will vote yes on the motion.
Have all members on this vote? The yeas are 220. The nays are 203. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The motion is passed. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, for what purpose? Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that I may hereafter be considered the first sponsor of H.R. 4394, a bill originally introduced by Representative Nunes, a previous member from the state of California, for the purposes of adding co-sponsors and requesting reprinting pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 12.
Without objection. Thank you.
Order in the House. Members take their conversations off the House floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for the purpose of inquiring to the Majority Leader the schedule for next week.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, also ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Appreciate that. With that, I now yield to my friend, the gentleman from Maryland, the Majority Leader for the House.
I thank Mr. Scalise for yielding. Madam Speaker, on Tuesday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed, as usual, till 6:30 p.m. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and 12 p.m. for legislative business. And again, as usual, on Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. The House, Madam Speaker, will consider Senate 2959, the Supplemental Impact Aid Flexibility Act, under suspension of the rules. This bill passed the Senate unanimously, is on suspension in the House. It's co-authored by Representative Joe Courtney of the House. This bipartisan legislation allows local educational agencies participating in the Impact Aid program to use the student count or federal property valuation data from their fiscal year 22 program applications for their fiscal year 2023 applications. This, Madam Speaker, will prevent schools from losing substantial funding upon which they rely to address COVID-19 learning loss by giving them more flexibility to use pre-pandemic data to calculate funding needs. The House may consider other bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. The House will also consider H.R. 4673, the eVest Act, sponsored by Chairman Mark Turcano of the Veterans Affairs Committee, the rule for which we adopted this week. This legislation would automatically enroll eligible veterans into the VA healthcare system so that no veterans are left behind when it comes to receiving quality, affordable health care. Lastly, Madam Speaker, the House stands ready to act on the Build Back Better Act, as well as the Freedom to Vote and John R. Lewis Act, should the Senate amend them and send them back to us. Additional legislative items, of course, are possible. And I yield to my friend from Louisiana.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. On the school bill, I know one of the big concerns many people have been raising is trying to get schools opened again. Last week it was reported that 5,200 different schools were closed last week. And I know this body has, this Congress has sent billions of dollars to school systems across the country. The intent was that that money be used to get schools opened, and yet there are some schools taking the money and staying closed, which goes against all the medical science out there. We know the damage that's doing to our young kids, but learning, depression, so many other challenges that it creates for them. Will there be any part of that legislation that helps require that in order to get money, schools have to be open? And I would yield.
Because I don't have it in front of me and I haven't read it as carefully as perhaps I should have, but I don't know the specific answer to that question. What I do want to say, however, is that we need to have kids in school. Everybody says that the learning experience is substantially compromised by virtual learning. It's better than nothing, and it's been pursued very vigorously and with great positive effect. But having said that, we all think that young people ought to be back in schools. But I don't know whether this bill, which passed the Senate unanimously, deals with that particular aspect that the gentleman asked about. But let me say this, that I think every school system has adopted the premise that in school is better. Clearly, we have been assaulted by a virus whose transmissibility is substantially more than the previous virus, the Delta variant. The Omicron variant, as we know, one of the problems is it's easily caught, easily transmitted. The good news is if you've taken a vaccination and had a booster, your likelihood of you going to the hospital is much smaller, and if you go to the hospital, you're much less sick. But having said that, we continue to have a challenge to get this under control, and the administration properly so, and the overwhelming majority of the medical community properly so, and the overwhelming majority of scientists are recommending that we wear a mask, that we wear a KN95 or N95 mask, because they're much better than the surgical masks or the cloth masks, that we continue to wash our hands regularly, and that we continue to keep a distance. But the gentleman and I agree that we need to ensure that to the extent that it is possible, and that parents will send their children to school because of being dissuaded by the transmissibility of this disease, we need to have kids in school.
Well, gentlemen,
I'll yield back.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Maybe we can work on something that would ensure that as tax dollars are going to school systems, that it's going to keep the schools open, not to allow them to then shut down on the kids, because as we know, the science is very clear that kids are much better off in school, safer in school than not being in school, and then the learning experience dramatically less if they're not in school, as well as the mental conditions, the social development that's not occurring if they are not in the classroom. So we'll see. And I'll be happy to yield on that.
Because I think I think everybody's concerned about this. Certainly every parent in my district and your district is concerned about this, and anybody who's concerned about the welfare of our children is concerned about it. But I think it would be appropriate for me to say that the teachers of America, now my wife was a teacher, and I happen to believe that teachers are the most important people in any society because they educate the leadership and the citizens of tomorrow. But they have been put to an extraordinary challenge. And I have a granddaughter who has 4 children, so I have 4 great-grandchildren, 3 of whom are in school, and we're in school in 2020 and 2021. And Judy, my granddaughter, who's named after my wife, has told me on numerous occasions what extraordinary ends her children's teacher, there were 3 different teachers at different levels in the school system, the extraordinary efforts to which the teachers went to make sure that while they were home, while they were learning virtually, that they had a positive, productive experience. But all of them felt, I think, a lot easier to have kids in school if they can do so safely. But I think that bears saying, like medical personnel, they have been put to extraordinary stress, as have parents generally been put to stress. So I think the gentleman's concern is rightfully placed, and we need to do everything we can to make sure kids get back in school and to have a learning experience like you and I had in the classroom. I yield back.
Thank you. And our teachers have been true heroes through this. Our hospital, our frontline hospital workers, people that work at grocery stores. We've seen so many people rising up to the challenge, and even where governments failed their ability to do their job. I know one challenge that hopefully we see resolved at the United States Supreme Court. It won't be today. We were expecting it maybe this week, but hopefully early next week we see the Supreme Court resolve these challenges where there were mandates on vaccines that required people to get fired from their job if they chose a health care decision on vaccinations. I've been vaccinated. I know a gentleman from Maryland has too, but for those who haven't, whether they're frontline hospital workers, teachers, people shouldn't be forced to lose their job based on that choice they make. But the Supreme Court will hopefully address that and resolve that next week. Something that's out of our hands now, but it is in the courts at the highest level. And I would yield to the gentleman on that.
Just because by my silence, I understand the gentleman's position, which is held by a number of people. My own view is that employers make a reasonable decision when they say to an employee, for the sake not only of the employee, but for everybody else in the workplace with whom they work, that is, you're required to be vaccinated because we believe that science and our medical personnel tell us that is a much safer route. But I understand there's a difference on that. I personally, but even then, I know governors who have been against vaccines are not necessarily against the employer requiring that as an employee requirement as opposed to a governmental requirement.
And I would hope the government would drop that mandate, but if not, it's hopeful that the court would make it clear that the government doesn't have the authority to require that people get fired if they don't get vaccinated. Encourage people to follow the science. If they have questions or concerns, that's a conversation they should have with their doctor, not a government mandate. But as the gentleman knows, we may have disagreement on that, but fortunately for us, it will get resolved at the Supreme Court, hopefully early next week. I wanted to ask the gentleman, as well as we're looking at the schedule for next week, I didn't notice any of the bills that we've highlighted in the past that would address some of the many crises our country is facing, whether it's inflation, whether it's high gas prices, whether it's the border crisis, all that are running out of control, the empty shelves that we're seeing at so many stores. Will the gentleman commit to working with us to bring some of the bills to the floor to address the real crises that are hurting hardworking families like the ones I just mentioned? And I would yield.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'd yield.
There's no doubt, first of all, let me say, inflation is a serious challenge confronting American families, particularly working families in this country. I live alone, and because it's just one person, I buy relatively small amounts of food at the grocery store. And I go to the grocery store nowadays, and whether it's the price of bacon, which is at $12 a pound for a good Hormel or another meat packing, it's high. And I think to myself how a family not doing as well as I'm doing and with kids to feed, how tough it is on them. So this inflation is very tough. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that's caused, obviously, by a pent-up demand, asking for a lot of goods and chasing a lot of goods. And elementary economics that any of us took in college know that there's a lot of resources chasing few resources, i.e. a lot of money chasing a short supply of goods, and that you have that demand that it drives prices up. This pandemic has had a global effect on supply chain. The supply chain has been substantially affected. This was not the fault of, frankly, either Biden or his predecessor in terms of what happened in the supply chain. In Singapore, they shut down companies, as you know, for months at a time. They just shut them down, which is one of the things that's led to this chip shortage, which has had ramifications. So I want to assure the gentleman that the administration, our side of the aisle, I know your side of the aisle, very concerned about the inflationary pressure that is putting such a stress on America's families. This pandemic has caused extraordinary, historic things to happen. That's the bad news. The good news is we've created more jobs in the last year and 2 months than were created. Of course, net, we lost jobs for the previous 4 years. It's over 2 million jobs net lost. So the good news is that we have a number of economic statistics that are, in fact, positive. However, having said that, we do need to be very concerned about inflation. The administration expressed their concern. We believe that the infrastructure bill will have a positive impact on inflation, assuming the Build Back Better Act passes, which I assume at some point it will. I think that's going to have a very positive effect on inflation because it will help the supply chain. It will help the health of the people, employees. It will make people more able to get out. Child care, going to help people get back to work, which will have a positive impact on the supply chain and on the availability of goods and services.